Okay, so you want to own a ranch. You buy a few thousand acres, build a house beside a line of cottonwood trees, fill the pasture with cattle, and let nature do most of the work. The cows eat grass that grows from sunlight and rain. Every spring, new calves appear. Every fall, trucks arrive. The calves are sold, and the cycle begins again. The land may rise in value while the herd reproduces on top of it. You own the scenery, the livestock, and the product. It sounds less like a business than a machine for turning grass into money. Here is the problem. The cows reproduce. The grass does not always come back. A ranch can contain millions of dollars in land, animals, equipment, and water systems, require work every day of the year, and still produce less cash than a much smaller passive investment. One dry season can turn the ranch's cheapest input into its most expensive one. A cow that lived almost entirely on pasture can suddenly require purchased hay, hauled water, supplements, and extra labor just to remain alive. And when the rancher finally gives up and sells her, the sale may look like revenue, even though the ranch has just sold the animal that was supposed to produce several future years of calves. That is the strange economics of owning a ranch. You are not buying cows. You are buying land, water, grass, and a biological production cycle that works only when nature produces feed more cheaply than you could ever afford to buy it. Before we get into the numbers, we need to separate several businesses that all use the word ranch. A cow-calf ranch keeps breeding cows and raises their calves until weaning. A stocker operation buys weaned calves and uses pasture to add weight. A feedlot finishes cattle on a concentrated ration before slaughter. A seed stock ranch sells genetics. A guest ranch sells lodging, riding, hunting, and the image of ranch life. The business we are talking about is the commercial cow-calf ranch because this is the version most people picture when they imagine owning land in a herd. Its product is not a steak. It is not even an adult cow. Its product is a healthy, weaned calf. The ranch keeps breeding females, tries to produce one calf from each of them every year, raises those calves on milk and grass, then sells most of them to the next stage of the beef supply chain. That puts the ranch at the very beginning of the process, where weather, reproduction, disease, and mortality decide how much product exists before anyone knows what the final beef market will look like. Now look at the first thing you need to buy: land. Ranch listings make acreage look like the product. 10,000 acres sounds better than 2,000. But acreage without context tells you almost nothing about productive capacity. One ranch may receive enough rain to grow dense forage for much of the year. Another may be so dry that one cow requires dozens of acres. One property may have deep soils, reliable springs, and several ponds. Another may have thin soil, seasonal water, invasive brush, and a beautiful view that does almost nothing for cattle. Two ranches with identical acreage can support completely different herds. This is why ranchers think in carrying capacity and stocking rate, not just acres. The purchase price can overwhelm the operating business before the first cow arrives. Imagine a ranch of 10,000 acres priced at $2,000 per acre. The land alone costs $20 million. Depending on climate and forage, perhaps it supports only a few hundred breeding cows. Even if the herd produces several hundred valuable calves every year, gross cattle revenue may still represent only a small percentage of the property value before feed, labor, taxes, repairs, interest, and livestock losses are paid. This does not automatically make the ranch a bad investment. It means the cattle are being asked to carry an asset much larger than the cattle business itself. A buyer financing the purchase at modern interest rates can discover that the land payment consumes more cash than the herd can reasonably generate. The same ranch may work for a family that bought it decades ago and fail for a new owner at today's price. The land produces a certain amount of forage. The cattle can consume only part of it because plants need leaves and roots to recover. Wildlife also uses the range, and some grass is lost to trampling, weather, and natural waste. Stock too lightly, and expensive land produces less revenue than it could. Stock too heavily, and the cattle remove forage faster than the plants can recover. Body condition falls. Calves gain less weight. Cows are less likely to breed again. Bare soil loses moisture and becomes vulnerable to erosion. The ranch creates a short burst of extra production by damaging the factory that produces future feed. The real factory is not the herd. The real factory is the grass beneath it. Carrying capacity is also not permanent. It changes with rainfall, temperature, pasture condition, grazing management, and water distribution. A ranch that safely supports 500 cows through several wet years may support far fewer during a prolonged drought. The dangerous years are often the good ones because they encourage the owner to expand. Grass is abundant, calves are heavy, more breeding females look like more future revenue. Then rainfall returns to normal or drops below it, and the ranch discovers that the herd was sized for the best version of the land rather than the average one. The extra cows do not stop eating when the weather changes. This makes stocking decisions a form of leverage. A ranch can borrow against the future productivity of its pasture by adding animals today. If rain arrives, the leverage works. If it does not, the owner has to replace missing grass with purchased feed. And purchased feed changes the business because grazing is the economic advantage of the cow-calf model. Cattle can convert plants that humans cannot eat into calves that eventually become beef. The ranch is competitive when the animal harvests most of its own feed by walking through pasture. Once trucks, tractors, hay equipment, storage, and outside suppliers must replace the pasture, the ranch begins buying a manufactured version of the input it was supposed to produce for itself. Grass also has a calendar. Spring forage may be abundant, but the ranch has to carry cows through summer heat, winter dormancy, snow, or a dry season depending on the region. The owner is not only asking how much grass exists today. The owner is budgeting forage across the entire production year. Graze too much early, and there may be nothing left when cows enter the most demanding stage of pregnancy. Feed too little before calving and body condition falls. Milk production weakens, calves grow more slowly, and cows take longer to breed again. A cheap feeding decision can reduce revenue months later after the connection is difficult to see. The land is not the only capital requirement. A working ranch needs fences, gates, corrals, handling equipment, wells, pumps, tanks, roads, trucks, trailers, and enough machinery to move hay, animals, and water when conditions turn bad. But the most important piece of infrastructure is often water. Cattle cannot use forage they cannot reach. A large pasture with good grass may be nearly useless if the nearest reliable water source is too far away. Animals concentrate around the few available tanks or ponds, overgraze nearby plants, and leave distant forage untouched. A new well or pipeline can increase the effective carrying capacity of land the owner already owns, but the cash must be spent before another calf appears. Then comes the herd. A breeding cow is not inventory in the same way a box in a warehouse is inventory. She is a biological production asset. Every year, she must become pregnant, carry the calf, give birth, produce milk, raise the calf, maintain enough body condition to remain healthy, and become pregnant again. If any part of that chain fails, the ranch may feed her for an entire year without receiving the expected product. An open cow, meaning one that is not pregnant, still uses grass, water, mineral, vaccines, labor, fencing, and land. Financially, the difference between her and a productive cow is an entire missing calf. The biological schedule makes correcting mistakes slow. A manufacturer can add another shift next month. A rancher cannot turn an empty cow into a saleable calf next week. If a female fails to breed, most of the revenue attached to her disappears for that production year. If the ranch decides to replace her with a young heifer, that animal must grow, be bred, carry a calf, and raise it before the replacement generates cash. A poor breeding season can therefore echo into the next one, while the bills attached to the land and herd continue without interruption. The same is true across the herd. 500 breeding cows do not automatically create 500 calves for sale. Some cows remain open, some pregnancies are lost, some calves die before weaning. Some young females are kept as replacements instead of sold. The rancher therefore watches the percentage of exposed cows that actually produce a weaned calf, because a small change can remove dozens of animals from the year's revenue, while most costs remain. This is enough to understand the biology. You do not need a complicated formula. The ranch earns money only when a cow turns a year of feed, water, and labor into a healthy calf that survives long enough to be sold. Even then, the calf is not a fixed unit of revenue. Calves are commonly sold by live weight, so price depends on how many animals are available, how heavy they are, their health, uniformity, sex, and the market on the day of sale.
A heavier calf usually brings more total dollars, but extra weight is not free. If grass creates that gain, it may be profitable. If expensive purchased feed creates it, the last pounds can cost more than the buyer pays. The rancher is not trying to grow the heaviest possible calf. The rancher is trying to grow weight for less than the market value of that weight. This is where the ranch begins to look less romantic and more like a low-margin production system. Feed, veterinary care, breeding, fuel, repairs, fencing, insurance, property taxes, interest, and livestock losses continue whether cattle prices are favorable or not. A pump breaks in the heat. A fence goes down during a storm. A cow begins calving at midnight.
The ranch requires attention every day, but most revenue may arrive only once or twice a year when calves are sold. The owner spends for months before discovering what the market will pay. The timing of cash makes this worse. Calves may be sold in one major group after months of expense. During the rest of the year, the ranch buys fuel, mineral, veterinary supplies, repairs, and feed without receiving matching daily revenue. Many operators use an operating line of credit to bridge the cycle. The bank is paid after the calf sale, then the process begins again. When prices are strong and calves are heavy, the line is manageable. When drought raises feed costs and lowers sale weights, the ranch can reach marketing season with more money borrowed and less product to sell. Interest turns bad weather into a cost that continues after the weather changes. Small ranches can survive this because family labor is often not fully priced. The owner repairs fences, checks cows before another job, uses older equipment, and accepts a return that would not satisfy an outside investor. On paper, the ranch may show a modest profit. Economically, part of that profit is unpaid labor and capital tied up in land. Larger operations can spread trucks, equipment, management, and labor across more cows, but scale does not eliminate the core problem. Every animal still eats every day. Every calf still depends on rain that the owner cannot order. There is also a difference between being asset-rich and being cash-rich. A rancher may own land and cattle worth millions while struggling to pay a repair bill without borrowing. Selling a few acres may damage the layout or reduce access to water. Selling equipment can make the next season harder. Selling cows provides cash fastest, but those cows are the production base. The balance sheet can look strong while the checking account remains thin.
This is one reason outside observers underestimate how quickly a weather event can force decisions. Wealth tied up in lands cannot buy hay tomorrow morning unless the owner borrows against it or sells part of the operation. The market price is also outside the rancher's control. It depends on national cattle numbers, feed prices, beef demand, imports, exports, packing capacity, and expectations about future supply. Cattle markets move in a slow biological cycle. When the national herd is small, calf prices tend to strengthen. High prices encourage ranchers to rebuild, but expansion requires them to keep heifers that could have been sold. That reduces current cash. The heifer must grow, be bred, carry a calf, and raise it before herd expansion creates another saleable animal. By the time enough ranchers expand, more calves reach the markets and prices can weaken again. High cattle prices create the future cattle supply that eventually brings high prices back down. The cattle cycle also changes the meaning of a high price. When calves become unusually valuable, the rancher appears to be receiving a windfall. But the breeding cows needed to produce more calves become more valuable too. Keeping additional heifers means giving up the best sale prices in years. Buying breeding females means paying prices inflated by the same shortage that made calves profitable. Expansion becomes most expensive precisely when the market provides the strongest reason to expand. By the time the new cows produce enough calves to repay that investment, the national herd may already be rebuilding and prices may be moving lower. Contraction works in reverse. When feed costs rise or drought reduces forage, ranchers sell cows and heifers. The immediate number of cattle reaching auctions increases, but the breeding herd shrinks. Future calf supplies decline. That can support higher prices later, but the rancher who liquidated may no longer own enough cows to benefit. This is why ranch revenue can temporarily rise during a crisis, while the business becomes weaker. Selling breeding animals creates cash today by destroying production tomorrow. And no event demonstrates this better than the Texas drought of 2011. Texas entered that year after dry conditions had already begun developing.
Then the rain failed on a scale that overwhelmed normal planning. Heat intensified evaporation. Pastures stopped growing. Hayfields produced little or nothing. Ponds and stock tanks dropped. Wildfires added another threat. Across the state, ranchers who normally relied on grass watched the cheapest input in their business disappear. For an individual ranch, the first stage of drought rarely looks catastrophic. Grass is shorter, but the cows still have something to eat. The owner delays selling because rain could arrive next week. Then hay feeding begins earlier than planned. A few loads are purchased. Ponds continue falling.
The rancher moves cattle between pastures, hoping to preserve enough cover for recovery. Each decision is reasonable on its own. The danger comes from the sequence. Money is spent protecting a herd sized for normal rainfall, while every week without rain makes the same herd more expensive to keep. The cattle did not disappear with it. They still needed protein, energy, minerals, and water every day. Some ranchers began feeding hay months earlier than usual. Others hauled water or moved cattle to rented pasture. But drought covered such a large region that alternatives became expensive at the same time. Local hay production collapsed. Transporting hay from distant states added freight. Neighbors who might normally lease spare grass were facing the same shortage. The crisis did not simply increase the price of one input. It removed the natural system the entire ranch was designed around.
This is why ranchers often carry more hay than they expect to use and treat stored feed like insurance. In a normal year, the stack may survive into the next season. During drought, that reserve disappears early. Once the ranch enters the open market for hay, it competes with every other livestock owner facing the same shortage. The price of hay rises, but quality can fall as buyers accept whatever is available. Freight becomes part of the feed bill. A cheap bale located hundreds of miles away may become expensive by the time it reaches the pasture. Texas agriculture ultimately suffered losses measured in the billions of dollars. For ranchers, those losses appeared through higher feed costs, lower sale weights, livestock deaths, and the forced movement of huge numbers of cattle to market. But the headline number still misses the most painful decision: which cows to keep alive. The owner then faces a calculation that is partly financial and partly irreversible. Feeding a productive cow for another month may preserve years of future calves if rain returns. Selling her today may prevent the ranch from running out of cash if it does not. The market does not reveal which decision was correct until later. A rancher who sells early may watch rain arrive and regret losing the herd. A rancher who holds too long may spend thousands on feed and still be forced to sell after the cows lose condition and local prices weaken. The business is not choosing between profit and loss. It is choosing which kind of loss remains survivable. Debt changes how long the owner can wait. A ranch with little leverage may choose to feed through one bad season and preserve the breeding herd. A heavily financed ranch may have less freedom. Land payments, equipment loans, and the operating line continue while calf weights and pregnancy rates weaken. The bank may not care that the herd has exceptional genetics or that the forecast finally shows rain. It cares whether the next sale produces enough cash to service the loan. The rancher can therefore be forced to sell the most liquid assets in the business, even when doing so damages the long-term operation. A rancher usually starts with the obvious culls: older cows, open cows, animals with bad udders, poor feet, or repeated health problems. Under normal conditions, selling them improves the herd. As the drought continues, the choices become harder. Productive cows with good histories go to auction because the ranch cannot feed them all. Replacement heifers selected over years are sold before producing their first calves. Genetics, adaptation to the local environment, temperament, and maternal performance that took generations to build leave on a truck. The sale creates immediate cash and lowers tomorrow's feed requirement. It may be the only rational decision. But the rancher is not merely selling inventory. He is selling the animals that were supposed to manufacture next year's revenue. Auction barns fill with cattle. A ranch that spent decades building a herd can reduce it in weeks. From the outside, the ranch may report unusually high cattle sale revenue that year. The number looks strong because the business is liquidating productive assets. The drought also changes the local market around the ranch. Trucking becomes harder to schedule because everybody is moving cattle or hay at once. Auction barns process more animals than usual. Buyers know that many sellers have limited choices. Light or thin cattle may be discounted. At the same time, the rancher is selling into a temporary flood of supply created by a shortage of grass. Years later, when the national herd is smaller, cattle prices may be much higher, but the ranch that liquidated no longer has the animals needed to capture the full benefit. If a manufacturer sells half its machines, the cash is not confused with normal product revenue. On a ranch, both the machine and the product are animals, so the distinction is easier to miss. A cull cow is a normal byproduct. A productive young cow sold because the grass is gone is a piece of the factory leaving the property. The drought, therefore, attacked more than one calf crop. Fewer cows meant fewer calves the following spring. Some animals that remained had poorer body condition, reducing pregnancy rates and calf weights. Damaged pastures needed time and rainfall to recover even after the weather improved. The drought did not only take 1 year of grass, it forced ranchers to sell several future years of revenue. Then came the rebuilding problem. Rain can return faster than a herd. Pastures may begin growing within weeks, but a rancher cannot order hundreds of mature, locally adapted breeding cows from a factory.
When many ranchers try to rebuild at once, demand raises the price of breeding stock. The same kind of cow that was sold under pressure during drought may cost far more to replace after conditions improve. Buying mature cows restores production faster, but requires substantial cash. Keeping heifers from the ranch's own calf crop protects genetics, but delays revenue because those animals are not sold and need time before producing calves. Either way, the recovery consumes capital. Rebuilding also forces the owner to decide what kind of ranch will exist after the drought. Buying cows quickly restores numbers, but may introduce animals poorly adapted to the property. Rebuilding slowly from retained heifers preserves the herd's genetics, but sacrifices calf sale revenue for several seasons. Some ranchers never return to their former size. They reduce stocking permanently, lease out part of the land, or decide that carrying fewer cows creates a more resilient business, even if gross revenue remains lower. The drought becomes a capital event, a biological event, and a strategic reset at the same time. This is the central economics of ranch ownership. The visible product is cattle, but the operating advantage comes from forage. When forage disappears, the owner can buy a substitute for a while. Eventually, the substitute becomes so expensive that cattle must be sold. And because breeding cattle create future calves, the response to today's feed shortage reduces tomorrow's revenue. Weather does not merely change 1 year's profit. It can change the size of the business for years. This leaves one final question. If cattle margins can be thin, labor so demanding, and drought risk so severe, why do people still pay enormous amounts for ranches? Because a ranch can be a weak cattle business and a strong land asset. Pasture values have risen over time, and some buyers value privacy, water, scenery, hunting, or long-term appreciation more than the annual calf crop. The cattle operation may cover part of the property's carrying cost, while most of the owner's wealth comes from the land itself. Some owners also confuse rising land values with proof that the cattle operation is profitable. If the property appreciates by several $100,000 while the herd barely breaks even, the owner's net worth still increases. But appreciation does not pay the feed bill unless the land is sold or borrowed against. This creates a ranch that looks successful from the outside and remains cash poor inside. The land can make the owner wealthy on paper, while the cattle business struggles to fund its next winner. That difference matters. A ranch purchased generations ago with little debt can survive on margins that would never support a new buyer paying today's price. The cows did not become less productive. The financial burden attached to the acres changed. This is why two owners can run similar herds on similar land and experience completely different economics. One is operating on inherited or long paid-off property. The other is asking cattle to service a modern real estate price that the calf crop was never designed to support. So if you do decide to own a ranch, understand what you are actually buying. You are not buying cows that automatically create more cows. You are buying land with a limited and changing carrying capacity, water systems that determine whether the grass can be used, breeding animals that consume resources for an entire year before producing a sale, and a commodity price you cannot control. You are buying a business where the factory can become pregnant, get sick, fail to breed, or die in a storm. You are buying a production cycle that takes years to expand and weeks to liquidate. Most importantly, you are buying exposure to rain.
When rain arrives, the ranch converts grass into calves at a cost no feed truck can match. When it does not, every animal becomes a daily decision about how much future revenue you are willing to spend to keep the biological factory alive. You are not buying cows. You are buying land, water, grass, and a long bet that nature will produce the feed more cheaply than you could ever afford to replace it. If you want more breakdowns of what expensive businesses really earn behind the scenes, subscribe to Money Anatomy.